The island leaders have previously said it is not for sale. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 4 points at 82.45. The pound buy is $1.25 and €1.20. LBC weather: clear, dry and cold for most tonight. Wintry showers for northern Scotland and a low of -9. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
New year, so let's get it off to a powerful start and bring into the conversation Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, the scandal of grooming gangs. The Prime Minister seeming to say that anyone who seemed to support the idea of a public inquiry was effectively getting on the bandwagon of being a right-winger.
If the government will not hold a full public inquiry, if they won't do it, we at Reform will do it.
What would your deadline be for the government to take action?
Well, I think we've probably got a few weeks, but no more than that. I think there is now overwhelming demand for us to know the full, unvarnished truth, however horrid it may be.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening to you. It's 2 minutes past 8. Don't worry, I've calmed down now. We have with us on Cross Question, sitting to my left, Vicky Ford, former Conservative MP and Minister. To her left, David Pinto-Duchinsky, Labour MP for Hendon. To my right, Cindy Yu, Assistant Editor of The Spectator. That's the second programme in a row we've had something from The Spectator on what is going on. And to her right, Mathew Hulbert, political commentator. He's host of the new political podcast, Political Frenemies, and he's also a Liberal Democrat activist. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call, and you can WhatsApp us on the same number, and we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's kick off with Billy in Colchester. Hello, Billy.
Hello, Ian. My question is, has the Tory party of David Cameron, George Osborne, Ella Soubry, Philip Hammond, Dominic Grieve and similar, has that gone forever?
And you're prompted to ask this by what Robert Jenrick has been saying today, are you?
Yeah, well, just generally, the fact that what Robert Jenrick is saying, and I think you're being too sympathetic to him, Ian, earlier, what Kenny Badenoch says, all those people, all the Tories...
Read my article, Billy. I don't think you'll detect any degree of sympathy at all there, but anyway. Vicky Ford. Now, I would always, if somebody said to me, what kind of Conservative is Vicky Ford, I would probably say an ultra-Cameroon.
Yeah, deeply wet, you'd probably say, wouldn't you?
So, no, not at all. No. How would you respond to Billy?
So I've always felt that the Conservative Party has to be quite a broad church. I was also a constituency neighbour of Kemi. I know Kemi very well. She's a big girl, she's a grown-up girl, and it's up to her how she handles her relationship with Rob Jenrick. I've always said that people on matters, especially sensitive matters to do with race, need to pick their language very carefully. And I hope Rob is listening to me when I say that. He should pick his language very carefully. Kemi has always been one who feels very strongly that you shouldn't make mass generalisations on issues to do with race and culture. That's very much how she that's not something I've ever seen her do. She avoids that. She's much more of a detailed, thoughtful person than that. So I've always believed that the Conservative Party needs to be a broad church. In answer to your question, I am a very strong fiscal Conservative, low-tax Conservative. Don't agree with Labour on your tax policies. But we absolutely need to have this review that's been asked for into everything that happened here. And that's
I'm sure we'll get a question on that later, so let's leave that to one side for a moment. David, do you miss the Conservative Party of David Cameron and George Osborne?
Well, Ian, I'm old enough to remember a Conservative Party where the kind of language that Robert Jenrick used wouldn't have been tolerated in the tea rooms, much less on the front bench. I'm also old enough to remember a Conservative Party, a decent Conservative Party, where when Musk said some of the stuff about Jess Phillips, Conservative frontbenchers would have condemned it. And so I'm not a hyper-partisan person. I have deep respect.
To be fair, we had Sir John Hayes, who's not a frontbencher,
Yes.
but he was on the programme earlier, seen as very much somebody on the hard right of the Conservative Party. He did do that.
Well, no, and I think that's to his credit, but I was really saddened that Chris Philp couldn't do the same thing. And so I am worried that the Conservative Party has changed. And in Kemi Badenoch, we've had, they've selected... Badenoch.
No bad in Badenoch.
In Kemi Badenoch, they've selected a leader who, rather than listening, rather than reflecting after one of the worst losses in Conservative history, has doubled down on exactly the kind of rhetoric that got them into these problems in the first place.
Mathew Hulbert.
Well, I do wonder why Robert Jenrick has made these comments. I mean, I always feel with him that everything he says is kind of calculated and said for a reason. And so I wonder what his reasoning is. I mean, is he looking having just lost the previous Conservative leadership election, is he looking forward to the next one and being the darling of the right of the party? I mean, I don't know, but I'm saddened that someone so prominent is making comments like that. I think they're very unfortunate indeed. And I agree with David that they should be condemned from top to bottom in the Conservative Party. And I think it says a lot about the modern Conservative Party that they haven't been. I mean, I think I first got interested in politics when I was about 14 in 1994. And I think of the Tory front bench then, and I must admit I didn't think a great deal of them then, but on reflection...
I was going to say, is there a Tory front bench you've ever thought well of?
No, but when I think of Ken Clarke and Michael Heseltine, I mean, these were significant figures. And yes, of course, I am being someone who I knew from straight off that I wasn't a Conservative, but you could respect these people. Whereas I look at the Tory front bench now, and I try to do it as neutrally as I can as a commentator, but I can't remember a weaker Tory front bench.
Well, to be fair, there's only 121 to choose from. But then again, the Liberal Democrats have only got 72, and their front bench is actually quite impressive, I think.
Indeed, and it's where you come from to where you now are. I mean, the fact is we went from a handful of seats to now having 72, and I think we do have some impressive people. It'll take a while for some of them to bed in. I met with Tom Gordon MP earlier today. He's one to look out for. But I think we do have some impressive people on our front bench. But the Tories, it's all much of a muchness.
Cindy?
I think one thing that has changed in politics is social media. So whereas politicians, the Ken Clarkes of the world, some people, Margaret Thatcher was Marmite, of course, but at least had a certain respectability and authenticity about her. But I think social media means that politicians today are chasing those social media clips. I mean, Labour's fallen foul of this week as well, in that unfortunate AI video. And it just means that people are looking for the clips, for the clickbait things, instead of actually what it is that their ideology and principles should say.
Jenrick's remarks were made on Twitter.
Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, this whole row, grooming gangs, of course, we need to talk about historic sexual abuses and race relations in this country, but this whole row, the latest iteration in the last couple of weeks, comes from Elon Musk. And it does feel like our real life is imitating the activities on social media, and it is just infantilizing our politics and making things much more fast-paced, but also much more superficial.
Anybody want to come in, or should we move on?
I think you're absolutely right. The living politics in a social media life is very different. I mean, I experienced that complete change, totally different from when I was first in politics 15 years ago, when you did have more time to pick your words. But I do think that politicians, especially those on the front bench of all parties, need to be very careful with their language here. And I don't think that, calling for people to resign is actually helpful. I think there is an issue here that these historic cases, and there are historic cases, the people affected by that still believe that the lessons have not been learnt and justice has not been carried out, and that they need to be listened to.
I completely agree. And I suppose for me, one of the sadnesses of exactly the dynamic you're outlining, Cindy, is that those voices, the voices of the victims, the voices of the people who suffered these horrific crimes, have in some ways been lost. And we're here talking about Elon Musk and Robert Jenrick, where what we really should be doing is talking about what action are we taking. Well, no, and that's exactly the wrong answer. And we'll come, I'm sure, to that, about what action we want to take. we've had lots of inquiries. In fact, Professor Jay herself said, we've had enough consultation, we've had enough discussion, we know the answers, now it's about implementing them, which I'm afraid to say the last Conservative government disastrously failed to do, which is why we're here.
Right, let's move on to a text question from Gareth in Cheshire. Should we be worried about Donald Trump's ambitions towards Canada, Greenland, and seemingly now countries in the Gulf of Mexico, or the Gulf of America as it's about to be called apparently? Trump has vowed to take control of Greenland from Denmark and also the Panama Canal, and wouldn't even rule out using military force to get them. Cindy?
I have to say that I don't know why Trump wants Greenland. Is it for security against Russia?
Well, so he says. Well, I don't know against Russia, but for national security.
I mean, I just take so much of what he says with a pinch of salt, and it is exactly designed to rile up people so that he can bolster his own support. He said he was going to build a wall in his first presidency, and what he actually built was not really a wall, but a border barrier. And it's so much of what he says is rhetoric, and this renaming of the Gulf of Mexico into the Gulf of America. Exactly. Yeah, I just
his evil plan is working.
I will believe it when I see it. Not to say that he is not an extraordinary president with pushing things out to areas that previous presidents haven't done. But I also think he is an extravagant person. He knows how to get attention. He likes to, as we millennials call it, troll. So just kind of basically tease people by just saying outlandish things, something that Elon Musk is very good at doing as well. So, I don't know what hard power benefits there would be to making Canada your 51st state or buying Greenland from Denmark per se. And I don't know if he knows necessarily.
I wonder what it would cost. How do you work out the cost of a country? I mean, it'd be quite interesting to do, wouldn't it? But I don't know how you do it. Mathew?
Well, as a bit of a political geek, and I know you won't believe this, Ian, but yesterday I was watching some of the Canadian network's coverage of Justin Trudeau. Oh, my hero, I'm still in deep mourning. All hail Justin Trudeau. But
said no one ever.
Said me. I was watching some of the Canadian network's coverage of his resignation yesterday. It was interesting that just a few minutes into the coverage, they were mentioning what Elon Musk had to say on the subject. So he's literally commenting on politics across the Western world whenever he finds time.
Well, if you can, why can't he?
Well, quite. Thank you. Whenever he finds time to run his businesses, I really don't know. But I think he says these things to shock Trump. Trump and Musk. But I think he says these things to shock. I don't think he has any intention of following through on that. Although we all await the famous first day, all the things that Trump is going to do on the first day. So we await it with, well, in my case, trepidation.
There was also a suggestion that all NATO countries should spend 5% of their GDP on defence. Now, that is considerably upping the ante. I mean, I happen to think he's probably right on that in the long term, but that will have a lot of, probably more reverberations than the other things in the long term.
Are we sure he knows what NATO is?
Well, we know he's not a fan of it particularly, I think.
No.
Well, but I think there is a serious point here about the 5%. It might not be 5% specifically that he wants, because the way he sees it is, you got to bid high, then maybe you get haggled down, but you got to bid high. But there's a serious point here, which is that Europe has to defend itself now under Trump. That is definitely the case, whether it's Ukraine or European interests in other borderlands, or perhaps, EU-China relations. Europe is on its own now, because Trump basically thinks that America shouldn't be a free policeman to the world. It should be an insurance company. He's basically said as much in the past to its allies. And so there's got to be a price to be paid for that.
David?
Well, look, I mean, on this defence point, it's absolutely right that many European countries do need to up their expenditure. And ever since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, we've seen, whether it's Germany, a whole range of other countries beginning to bid that up. And so let's kind of see where that goes. But it's right that as the world becomes more dangerous, it's right that we see more investment in defence. And by the way, we're going to see that in Britain too. I still remain convinced that the US is as committed as ever to the NATO alliance, which is the cornerstone of the international order.
Do you really think that? I mean,
Yes.
after Trump's first term, I'm surprised you say that.
Yes, and so look, presidents can come and go, but the US commitment to its strategic interest remains, and clearly it's a cornerstone of our security. But it's really important that we all invest in our defence, and that I think that investment goes up as the world becomes a more dangerous place, and I think that's exactly what we're going to see.
Vicky Ford.
So starting on defence, I was one of the Conservatives who called the last Conservative government and said we needed to spend more on defence and lobbied very hard for that, which is one of the reasons why one of the final steps that Rishi took was actually a big increase in our commitment to defence spending. Labour's actually rolled back on that and doesn't seem to be giving a timing. It's taking too long, in my view, to get their review.
Well, they're having a strategic
They are having a strategic defence review, but that is, you know, concerns about the timing. I do think we need to invest more in defence. I think when it comes to Trump, I've been a Foreign Office minister. I think I would be thinking about Trump in terms of, you know, what do we need to be concerned about from a UK point of view as well. So issues of how he wants to handle his relationships with the other Americas, they're interesting, but in terms of all the white noise that Trump is creating, and he will create a lot of white noise, you know, that's probably not our battle to get as worried about as the issues of how that could affect Europe. And the issue with Ukraine is, again, it's much more of a geopolitical issue to me rather than just a Ukraine issue. If we let Russia get away with what happens in Ukraine, then what message does that then give to China? You're the China expert here with our ambitions.
She's pointed to Cindy,
well.
by the way,
Cindy,
not me.
by the way, is a China expert. Yeah, you just lag around you, Ian. But Cindy's the
Matthew
China
knows
expert.
a hell of a lot about it, too.
You know, with their ambitions and other countries. So that's the biggest strategic issue, and I think Trump, who was initially much more to stop the war immediately, has calmed down on that and is being more strategic in his thinking towards Ukraine.
Right, lots of time for more questions. 0345 6060 973. 70 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Do it.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
19 minutes past 8 on Cross Question. David Pinto-Duchinsky is here, Labour MP for Hendon. Now, is it right that you're the most marginal seat in the country now?
Yes. I had a majority of 15, which is 14 more than I needed, so doing well.
Now, you have an interesting, I'm going to say father, or it could be grandfather, who he started off the British general election of series with David Butler in 1945, didn't he?
In 1970, he wrote.
Oh, did he? Oh,
Yes.
sorry, I thought he was one of the first ones.
But yes.
So political academic of some repute.
Political academic, and prior to that, a Holocaust survivor. So actually, that's why I've got the slightly odd name, because he came here as a child refugee after the Second World War.
Well, it's certainly a name that nobody will ever forget.
Or often pronounced right, but that's another thing.
Oh, have I done it wrong?
Oh, no, you've been brilliant.
Right,
Thank you.
Vicky Ford, can't pronounce your name wrongly, can I? Former Conservative MP, Cindy Yu, Assistant Editor of The Spectator, and Mathew Hulbert, political commentator. He's got a new podcast, which we'll talk about in a second, called Political Frenemies. But first, let's get on to another question. It's from Oscar in Shropshire. Will this be the last year of the war in Ukraine? Now, over the weekend, Ukrainian armed forces launched a new assault into the Kursk region of Russia. On Friday, the former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, guest-hosted a show here on LBC, during which he said he believes a peace deal will be negotiated by Trump, which needs a demilitarised zone established along the current battle lines like that between North and South Korea. And he said British troops will be asked to police it. Well, that's interesting. David?
Look, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a military expert. I'm not going to pretend that I have an answer to whether the war will end. But I think certainly from our point of view, if we worry not just about Ukraine, Vicky actually raised a really important point earlier. Russia's illegal war in Ukraine is, an appalling violation of international law. But leaving aside that violation itself, it has huge consequences for our global system and for whether force will be seen as a legitimate and useful tool in future. So it's critically important that Russia does not prevail. And that's why, and again, this is a cross-party point, I'm proud of the fact that on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, we've been steadfast in our support for Ukraine. Look, the war's very difficult, but it's absolutely essential our support continues. That's why I'm proud that the government's pledged $3 billion a year for as long as it will take, is leading the European loans on the ammunition fund, etc. And has also been very clear about Ukraine's future in NATO. But I think all of this is critical because what we do in Ukraine won't just shape the map of Europe, but will shape the way people behave around the world.
Are you not fearful, though, that if there is some sort of compromise deal, that Putin will be able to claim it as a victory? I mean, if he keeps Crimea, if he keeps the Donbas region, he can, even though obviously the original objective was to conquer the whole country, he could still paint that to his people as some sort of victory.
Well, look, there's a whole separate question about how Putin communicates with the Russian people and what he's going to say. What we've got to worry about is the security of Europe, and, as I say, the precedent it sets globally. And this is why, we talked earlier about defence spending. That's why it is important it's going up. I would have to pick up Vicky on just one point, which is the Tories did promise 2.55%, but didn't put any money behind it, whereas Labour is actually going to come up with a plan. And in fact, the only time 2.5% has ever been hit in the last, I think, 20 years was under a Labour government. But look, I think what happens in Ukraine...
That was because we were in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, look, but let's come back to it. Whether it's the size of the Navy, which is now, I think, the smallest since Napoleonic times, whether it's the size of the Army, now sub 80,000, and whether it's the fact that we had a Conservative Secretary of State for Defence saying the armed forces had been hollowed out. The very fact we find ourselves in this position, and credit to Conservatives like Vicky, who railed against it, is because the Conservatives fundamentally mismanaged our national defence. But that makes it even more important that we invest now, but as the government's laid out, that through.
If they'd fundamentally mismanaged defence, why was it that Britain was the leading country in Europe supporting Ukraine and providing more military hardware than any other country?
And so, look, as I've said, on both sides of the aisle, I think there's been strong support for Ukraine, and that's to be lauded. But that is a separate question from how we've invested in our own armed forces, to which the answer is badly and not enough.
Vicky Ford, that's a fair accusation, isn't it? Given the size of the army, we were told the other day, quite why this was made public, I do not know, that around 10 to 15,000 troops in the British Army aren't even medically fit to fight a war anyway.
Yeah, that was concerning, wasn't it? So let's not go back into the mess that the Labour government left us with in 2008 or whatever, 2010, because we'll be here all night. The question is, will this be the last year of war in Ukraine? Listen, I would love to see an end to the war in Ukraine. I'd love to see an end to the war in Gaza, and I would dearly love to see an end to the war in Sudan, which has been massively horrific and slipped off the public eye because people have been focusing on Ukraine and Gaza. But it needs to be a sustainable peace. Because there's been, the peace before in Ukraine, which never led to peace and actually led to this illegal invasion. You're right, it was an illegal invasion. And it needs to be a war that doesn't leave Putin, a peace that doesn't leave Putin feeling empowered, that he can just move on and make the next step, because that's always been the risk here, that Ukraine would be the first step and then he would feel, I can move on and I can move into the Baltics, I can move into Poland. Why Baltic nations and Poland been so concerned the whole way through this, let alone feeling that it can empower China against Taiwan. And that really matters to us because a difficult situation in Taiwan would cause a global crash because of the semiconductors market, etc. And that would really impact us here. So where you have these wars happening, which on a map look like really, really far away parts of the world, they end up impacting us, okay? They end up impacting the stability of the UK. Why do I say Sudan matters? It's the third biggest population in Africa. Instability in Sudan causes instability all across East Africa. That risks more and more people coming on small boat routes, etc. More pressure on immigration. Russia always knew that. Russia was funding one side of the war in Sudan from the very beginning because they knew this would create more instability in Europe. So we have to make sure that if there is a peace deal in Ukraine, it is, as far as possible, a sustainable one and a one that doesn't empower those bad guys in the world to continue on being evil actors.
Cindy.
I mean, it's very hard to disagree with Vicky. I just don't know if by we mean the UK or even the EU more widely, get a choice in what happens in Ukraine this year, in a sense that I do think the conflict will end because Trump is coming in, and to Matthew's point earlier about things that Trump's going to do on the first day, he has said he's going to end the war in 24 hours. I mean, I don't actually think he will. I think it's going to be a bit more complicated than that, but he will try to negotiate something because that was one of the platforms that he was voted in on. And whether or not that peace is good for Ukraine or good for Europe, I just don't think we can have any guarantee of that. Trump just wants to kind of stop this kind of this bill that's coming down the line, that the US has already spent so much defending Ukraine and Europe. He just wants to stop that. He wants to pivot and focus on Taiwan and China. Whether that peace is going to be lasting, I just don't know. My Ukrainian colleague Svetlana Morinets always says that this is not, the war did not start in 2022. For her, as a Ukrainian, the war started in 2014. Yeah. So that's why I think this particular conflict will end this year, but this will not be the end of Russia's kind of attempts to take more and more of Ukraine, especially with Putin at the helm. And so, but maybe, fundamentally that is what diplomacy is. You try to get the peace wherever you can. I just don't know if Trump is the person with the Ukrainian interests at heart necessarily.
Matthew.
Well, I'd like to see Ukraine win outright, but it seems very unlikely that is going to happen. But I do think we should remark on the absolutely remarkable resilience of the Ukrainian people, which I don't think many people really expected. Truly incredible, one of the great stories of the last few years. But it's hard to see how this conflict ends without some kind of agreement. And to your point, Ian, yes, it'll probably be an agreement where...
But who does the agreement have to be between? Because people say, sort of like the EU, Britain, obviously we've been helping Ukraine as much as we can. But in the end, it's surely got to be down to the Ukrainians what they agree to.
Indeed, I think somehow, don't ask me how, I'm not a defence expert, unlike my podcast co-host, but I think that it needs to be some kind of agreement between Zelensky and Putin. Now, I doubt that'll be direct. It needs to be via somebody. But I think in the end, that is what has to happen. And I was just going to say, it probably will be something where Zelensky can claim victory and Putin can claim victory.
So, and just to add one thing to this, and I think you raise an important point, and as I say, I don't know what's going to happen, but so many of these discussions, Ian, exactly to your point, deny agency to the Ukrainians. There were Ukrainian parliamentarians visiting just before Christmas. They were enormously impressive. And I think we need to be careful that discussions about Ukraine don't actually leave them out of the equation.
Absolutely. We've always said it's got to be the Ukrainians' decision.
But whether or not it is their decision depends on where they get the funding to keep fighting the war.
And
if they cannot win this war at all, and the Americans pull out their money, the EU actually have given Ukraine more money than the US, I think it is, but although the EU doesn't talk about it as much. So if Europe can get its act together, and to the point about NATO, upping NATO defence, then Ukraine still has a chance. But at the moment, it seems like if America pulls the plug, then the Ukrainians don't really have a chance to say no. they have to just sign whatever deal is presented to them, perhaps.
Well, on that cheerful note, we will move on. Lots more to talk about in the remaining half an hour of the programme. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 8:30. Let's get the news headlines from Daryl Jackson.
Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips says comments made about her by Elon Musk have turned her world upside down. She says the billionaire knows absolutely nothing about victims of grooming gangs after calling for a new public inquiry. A 14-year-old boy has been stabbed to death on a bus in southeast London this afternoon. The teenager was treated for his injuries but died at the scene in Woolwich following the attack. And more than 100 flood warnings are in force across England, and more rain, sleet and snow are on the way. A danger to life warning issued for the River Soar in Leicestershire has now been removed. LBC weather: clear, dry and cold for most tonight. Wintry showers for northern Scotland and a low of -9.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:33 on the panel tonight. David Pinto-Duchinsky, Labour MP for Hendon. Mathew Hulbert, political commentator, co-host of the Political Frenemies podcast. Cindy Yu, assistant editor for the Spectator, and Vicky Ford, former Conservative MP. Now, you had some horrible news over Christmas, Vicky, which you're going to stay on and talk about more after 9 o'clock. Just take us through what happened.
So the news was actually confirmed yesterday that I have breast cancer. It's good news. I have a very, very small lump. It's been found very early. So in terms of getting cancer, I sort of feel as if I've won the lottery, and that's the lucked in there.
You've always been a great optimist.
I'm trying to approach this as positively as possible, and I have to say the NHS has been absolutely fabulous. I went in before Christmas for a routine mammogram. I got the recall letter to ask me to go for a follow-up appointment, which I went to between Christmas and New Year, where they saw the lump and confirmed there was a lump there using an ultrasound. All of this very unpainful, bit uncomfortable but not painful. They were incredibly reassuring that it was a very small lump, but I asked at that appointment what the chances are that it wasn't cancer, and I was told that was a very low chance. So over New Year and last weekend I was getting my head around that. And then when we went in for the appointment yesterday, they confirmed that it is a small cancer. So I guess, Iain, my real message to everyone is please go for your cancer checkups. If you get called by the NHS, go for your checkup, because I am so grateful that they found that lump. And for me, that's going to mean that I will have a surgery to remove the lump, and then probably just some radiotherapy, which I didn't even know that you could get away with just radiotherapy and not chemotherapy. So I'm really pleased about that. But as I said, the NHS, they've had a really difficult time in a lot of the hospitals, but that service, oh my goodness, they've been unbelievable.
Well, we're going to talk about this a lot more after 9 o'clock. I mean, the overarching question in the next hour is, if you've had a cancer diagnosis, how do you react to it? How do you cope with it? So we're going to talk to Vicky about that and also get your stories too. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Chris in Stubbington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Iain and panel. The winter crisis on hospitals and A&E departments is a yearly event. Do we just not have enough hospitals and beds?
Well, several NHS trusts in England have declared critical incidents because of the long waiting times in A&E units, with the number of flu cases particularly high this year. I think, is it the Royal Liverpool Hospital saying a 50-hour wait in A&E? Now, just imagine that. Lots of ambulance services have had issues over the Christmas period as well. So does the NHS just not have enough beds because these crises seem to happen every winter? Well, Wes Streeting was on LBC this afternoon with Sheila and was saying that's got to be an aim to make sure this doesn't happen every year. Mathew Hulbert, how realistic is that? Because it's quite difficult to see how you can solve a situation that's been happening for, 30, 40 years, if not longer.
I think it's incredibly difficult to solve, but I agree with Wes Streeting on this when he said that the NHS won't be fixed until social care is fixed, which is why I'm saddened that we're into yet another review. I want to see action on social care, and I won't go at length because I've talked about it ad infinitum on air, but as some listeners will know, my mum died 2 days after waiting 11 hours for an ambulance after a fall at home in 2022. And part of the reason for that, I subsequently learnt, was that ambulances were backed up outside a local hospital. The reason they were backed up outside the local hospital is because there were patients in the hospital able to come home, well enough to come home, but who didn't have a care package for them at home. So I'm afraid fixing the NHS won't happen until social care is fixed, and that will now not be for several more years.
The beds issue is something I've been banging on about for years. When I wrote a short book on the NHS in 2015, and I spent quite a long time researching the decline in hospital beds since the 1980s. And it was actually quite alarming. And we're now in a situation where in the whole of England, we have fewer than 100,000 beds in the NHS. It used to be 210,000. Now, Cindy, that's got to be part of it. But of course, if you add more hospital beds in, you then need more doctors, more nurses, and I don't know what each bed costs, but it's all very simple to say, well, this decline in beds needs to be reversed, but the money has got to be there to pay for it.
But the money has been increasing into the NHS over the course of those years as well. So I'm not an expert on the NHS. I don't know where the money has necessarily gone to. If beds are falling and care is getting actually worse per capita, where does that money go? And actually, of the 22 billion that the government announced in the last budget, it seems like a lot of that has gone into a pay rise, which of course for some of these medical professionals very, very deserved, but also into deficits. So actually, the NHS at the time said this is not going to lead to an improvement in actual care. £22 billion and not lead to an improvement in actual care. I think the answer must lie in things like Matthew is talking about, organisational reasons why it's not working. Why are we having healthy people in hospital who are not vacating those beds? You know, some of it is to do with data, the fact that nurses and doctors don't actually know how long someone's going to take up in terms of a hospital bed, depending on the condition that they have.
And that we don't respect people who work in care professions, and we don't pay them sufficiently well.
And that's part of it. That's why we don't respect them, because if you think someone's on minimum wage and you think, well, hang on, this is supposed to be a professional job, how can we respect it?
Absolutely.
Which we should, but I think that's the thought process. Vicky Ford.
So it's a really tricky one. But if you remember this time last year, we weren't actually talking about crisis in A&E. even though it was in the middle of the winter, because this time last year, a huge amount of work had happened on that whole discharge issue that Mathew has spoken about. And it is really important that you do get the system working between getting people out of hospital and into social care. And the new government did not do that, as I understand it, for this winter in the same way as it happened last year. Joining up between the NHS and social care is absolutely critical. And then the other thing that will make a big issue on A&E is whether or not GPs are able to stop people from going into A&E. And two things have happened so a big thing that's happened to both A&E and social care is, of course, the national insurance pay rise, which both GPs and social care have to pick up, and that's put more pressure on their budgets. More GPs are referring people into A&E, as I understand it. There's more pressure on the social care providers. They're not being able to take people out of the hospital. You couple that with a really bad flu season. Now, I don't know about you, Ian, but I tried to get a flu jab in December and I was told there's no flu jabs left anywhere.
That's because I'd used mine.
So, and that was me saying I want to pay for it privately, but it feels like the government didn't get its act together in advance of this flu season either.
On the flu jab, can I just give a shout out to my good friend, former presenter on this station, James Whale, who's in hospital in Kent with influenza, and he said he didn't have a flu jab, and he says, big mistake, I wish I had.
Big mistake. But I wanted to have one, and I tried to go and get one, and I was told there's no flu jab available, so there clearly wasn't enough flu jab available. There's been this extra pressure on GPs saying they're not being properly funded. A lot of the money that's gone into the NHS, you're absolutely right, Cindy, that's gone into pay rises rather than improvements. And we've now got crisis in our NHS. I am not going to talk down the NHS. They've been amazing for me, but we do need to have a government who realises that all of these bits need to work together, and you can't sort this out by just picking off different groups for pay rises.
David?
Well, but with respect, that's exactly why the government's taking the approach it does. Let me touch on three things. Firstly, the short-term thing, then the beds, and then the issue of social care. I mean, firstly, on the winter crisis, look, as you say, I think we have 3 times as many people as normal in hospital beds with flu this year. The government...
Well, that's not quite true. It's 3 times more than last year, but the previous year was actually another bumper year.
Fine. But so 3 times more than last year. And the government, whether it was settling the pay disputes, I think this is the first winter in 3 years we haven't had an NHS dispute, whether it's rolling out the RSV vaccine, took steps, but obviously the situation's unacceptable, and obviously it takes more than a few months to clean up the mess of the last 14 years. But on your point about capacity, I'd start from a couple of places. One, the last government didn't invest in capacity. Actually, spend per capita on the NHS actually went down. Secondly, when we talk about beds, we don't just mean the physical beds. The thing that really makes beds operational is the people, and the lack of investment in training the staff and capacity around them to actually activate the beds is why beds aren't available. And that's been a core focus of this government.
But there are more doctors than ever, there are more nurses than ever, there are more admin staff than ever.
And yet that hasn't led to rises in productivity because it hasn't been well managed. And to pick up on Cindy's point, it's just not the case that there's been no impact. Just yesterday, we had the Prime Minister announcing a plan that will see waiting lists cut to a point where currently less than 60% of people seen within 18 weeks. By 2029, it will be over 90%. Right, where we're seeing millions of extra appointments rolled out, even more than what was promised in the Labour manifesto. 17 new surgical hubs. I could go on. So I don't think that's right.
There's no guarantee that you're going to meet those targets.
No, but absolutely concrete action around actually freeing up appointments this year, which is why we're going to see a cut in the waiting list by next year, and so that's in the plan. But to the third point about social care, firstly, I'm so sorry to hear of your loss. I mean, it must be absolutely shattering, and I can't even begin to imagine what that feels like. I think for me, it flags up a couple of things. Firstly, social care does need to be reformed. There's no question of that. Yeah. And you're right, we need to get the integration better between health and social care. But that's exactly what the government's
But why have another review? What's the point of it?
Precisely because, in just the same way as pensions, and we saw this with the Turner Review of Pensions back in 2006, if you are going to get a sustainable answer to this problem, you've got to have cross-party consensus, and you've got to look at the whole system.
But that's already there.
No, but it really isn't. And this is why so many previous governments have failed. So if you don't go through that process, there is no consensus. There is no consensus.
How many years will that take? I mean, how many more of my mums will there be?
No. And so absolutely. And so phase one of the review will report next year, within a second phase for the spending review. I understand the frustration, but again, if we don't get this right, we will be back here in a decade. And by the way, I finish up. So I was a special advisor in the last Labour government. We put forward proposals that would have fixed social care through social insurance. They were shot down by the Conservatives as a death tax. Theresa May put forward proposals. They were shot down by her own party. We've had several attempts to do this, and because it hasn't been cross-party, and because it hasn't worked on that basis of technocratic consensus, it hasn't stuck. That's the key.
Right. We're going to move on. 0345 6060 973 if you have a question for our panel. It's 8:46.
This is LBC.
Do it.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:48. David Pinto-Duchinsky, Cindy Yu, Vicky Ford and Mathew Hulbert are here. Now, Mathew, tell us about your Political Frenemies podcast.
Yes, there's just not enough political podcasts.
No, indeed.
So we thought that we'd have another one. And yes, I'm afraid it is another one where two middle-aged white guys are talking about politics. But me and my friend Chris couldn't be more politically different. He's quite right-wing conservative. I'm quite centre-left Liberal Democrat.
Quite moderate, personally.
Well, don't tell him he's moderate, because he likes to think that he's not moderate, so he'll be very offended by that, Iain. But we debate the news, we disagree fairly robustly, but then we're friends. I was with him earlier on in this building, we had a good cup of tea earlier on today, and we get on very well. So we have our robust debate, and then we're friends afterwards, and that's the theme.
Where did you get that original idea of disagreeing agreeably on a podcast?
I just don't know, but I can...
It is everywhere now, Ian.
Well,
You should trademark it.
But I can assure you that one of us won't be entering the Lords or becoming a minister. So who knows how long we'll run for?
Well, quite. Let's go to a text question from Kate in Manchester. Should the England cricket team boycott playing Afghanistan? Now, a government spokesperson has today called on the International Cricket Council to apply its own rules, which do dictate that Afghanistan should be fielding a women's team after 160 cross-party politicians called for the England team to forfeit their match against Afghanistan at the upcoming ICC Champions Trophy tournament in Pakistan. Yesterday, the England and Wales Cricket Board said it would rather see a collective stand by all the other international cricket boards than have the England team hold their own individual protest. So displaying basically no courage whatsoever. Who knows most about cricket here? Vicky.
I'm going to declare an interest. I'm on the board of Essex Cricket.
Are you?
Yes.
Can you organise for me to join you? Being an Essex boy.
You can become a member. Well, hopefully, I'll get you write your cheque, become a member, and then we'll see how we do. So I absolutely think that the England cricket men should take a stand here. Okay, we have got fantastic things going on for women's cricket in this country. We are about to launch the first ever professional league for women's cricket in this country with 8 teams across the country. Essex is one. Not that I'm my favourite or anything. And we've got the England Cricket Board on one hand saying England and Wales Cricket Board saying cricket is going to be the most inclusive sport in the entire country. And then when it comes to talking about Afghanistan being totally wishy-washy and saying, oh, we don't know really, we think everybody should act together. No, Afghanistan is the most disgusting, brutal regime against women. They treat their women worse than they treat their dogs. It is appalling. Women are not allowed to go to school, they're not allowed to talk in public, they're not allowed to meet, they're not allowed to have jobs, they're not allowed to be trained even as midwives. We have to take a stand for the women of Afghanistan. And if that means that our men's cricket team should throw some balls and not play this match, then they should do that. Please, men, for the women, take a stand against this regime.
David?
Well, look, I mean, firstly...
Quite feisty.
No. Seriously, tell us what you really think, Vicky.
Quite feisty. It is not good enough.
So look, and let me start by just saying the treatment of women in Afghanistan is despicable. Now, I have to declare an interest here. Many, many years ago, I spent time in Afghanistan. I actually worked in Afghanistan on aid and recovery. And what has happened to that country is heartbreaking. And the treatment of women is beyond belief. And some of the people I know, some of the people who I knew and talked to me about what it was like to live under the previous Taliban a regime as a woman. I mean, I shan't. This is a family program. It's before the watershed. It's simply appalling. And look, of course, this is ultimately a decision for the ICC and the ECB. But I'm very glad that the government has been talking to the ECB, and I'm very glad that the ECB is now making representations on this.
Do you not think they should provide a lead, though?
Well, look,
as Vicky says.
As I say,
I think they may need to.
As I say, it's it's the ICC's decision, but I think government's been very clear that they want the ECB to lobby hard on and make representations, and I'm glad they're doing it.
Cindy, cricket your sport?
No. But I do know about women and authoritarian regimes. I think I agree with much of what's been said. Of course, the way that Afghanistan treats its women is absolutely appalling. I just can't help but feel that this whole conversation is just virtue signalling. I'd rather see a country like the UK open up safe routes for Afghans coming to the UK. If it's such an appalling regime, why don't we help the actual people who are there? Who cares, frankly, if we played them in cricket or not? I don't think the women of Afghanistan are then going to cheer and say, oh, thank God the English cricket team is standing up for us. I just feel like there are real, tangible things that governments who make hard decisions can do. And this whole debate, important in the area of cricket, but it's not going to help the women of Afghanistan in any way at all.
Matthew?
I agree with Cindy on that point. But in terms of, talking about how terrible things are in Afghanistan today. Yes, they are, but that didn't happen in a vacuum. And as much of a fan as I am of Joe Biden, and I think he's been a very good president by and large, I think that one of the great mistakes that he made, and I think, with Boris Johnson, he was Prime Minister, I believe, at the time here in the UK, is just kind of leaving Afghanistan to its fate. And I think that was pretty darn shameful. And I think all the leaders involved in that should hang their heads in shame. The fact that I know we've been there a very long time. I know that people get lethargic about their military being in a country for a very long time. I absolutely understand that. But they left Afghanistan and its women and girls to its fate. And they should hang their heads in shame.
Do you think the England cricket team should boycott the Afghanistan match?
I mean, I'm a bit nonplussed about that. I agree with Cindy. It's symbolic. I mean, symbolism sometimes matters, so in which case, fine. But I'd rather have the safe and legal routes that Cindy speaks of.
Okay.
It is a sport that they care about passionately in that country. If you let them play these matches, they will believe that they are being treated as normal. It is not a normal country.
Right, now I need brief answers on this next question. It's from Georgina in Hampstead. What's more important, free speech or tackling misinformation? And this is on the back of Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp owner Meta announcing today that it's shutting down its external fact-checking systems and instead relying on those platforms' users doing their own crowdsourced fact-checking, like the community note system employed by Twitter. Meta boss Mark Zuckerberg says there have been just too many mistakes and too much censorship. Last week, former Deputy Prime Minister Sir Nick Clegg announced he's leaving his role as Meta's head of global affairs to be replaced by a former Republican White House advisor called Joel Kaplan. I'm sure that's entirely coincidental to the fact that they've announced this today. David?
So look, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not completely up to speed on this has been announced only in the US, and I'm also clear that operating here, they would be subject to the Online Safety Bill. Online Safety Act, and so regardless of what they do in the US, they will have to comply with British law. The only other thing I'd say is that literally it's in the news about Jess Phillips and how the appalling abuse triggered by outrageous misinformation has turned her life upside down. I don't think it's free speech or kind of misinformation. With if you have misinformation, it's harder to have free speech, and it fundamentally diminishes the public square. We can't have that.
Cindy?
Yeah, this question is very hard to answer briefly, but I think if I had to lean on one side, I'd say free speech, because people are the best judge of what they decide to believe or value, and I'd rather individuals decided that than big tech companies.
Vicky?
I think free speech is really important, but I don't think that what Meta publish is free speech, because they are making money off the speeches that they publish. They're using that to drive advertising. They're using their algorithms to send that to different people and amplify it. So not all speech is being treated equally, as it were. And unless they get their act together, and they do need to comply with the Online Safety Act and have the ability to take down what can be horrific speech, the abuse towards Jess, some of the harms that we've seen towards children, they have to comply with those rules. So I think you have to have both. You need to make sure that people can get published without being censored, but we need to be really careful about these big companies who just say we're going to turn a blind eye to content, but then we're going to pump it at you using our algorithms.
Matthew?
I think tackling misinformation is the most important. I'm a believer in free speech, but let's be totally honest here. We all have our speech curtailed. There are certain things that we can't say live on air, certainly without getting ourselves...
I was going to say, like what?
certainly without getting ourselves in trouble. So our speech is curtailed within the law, and that's quite right. So, but we absolutely need to tackle misinformation. It's the great problem of our age.
Right, let's move on to our fun question, which I know you've all been waiting for. Bobby in Didcot says, with Trump wanting to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, where else in the world do you think could do with a rebrand to improve its image? Vicky?
Yeah, we're not allowed to say Tunbridge Wells because that got you in big trouble, so I just said it. Listen, I grew up in the most beautiful town.
There was an ejector seat now.
The most beautiful town. Done it!
Yeah.
In Northern Ireland, town of Omagh. It's the most beautiful town.
So why does
and
it
of
need a
course, it's the
rebrand?
town that everybody knows as the scene of the biggest bomb of the IRA troubles.
Okay.
And I'd like it to be known as the most beautiful, wonderful,
How
peaceful
easily can you
town.
switch the accent back on?
So my parents were both English
Right.
and were English doctors at Enoma, so I always had English accents at home. But yeah, I want to brand that as just go and visit it. It's absolutely beautiful and the people are
David.
wonderful.
Look, it's going to come as no surprise to you whatsoever that as a loyal constituency MP, I believe Hendon is the centre of the universe and is a fantastic place. So I don't want to rebrand it at all. I want to advertise it and say, come to Hendon, come to our
typical politician, you're not answering the
fantastic
question.
RAF museum in Colindale. Come, it doesn't need a rebrand. It just needs the public.
Well, nobody suggested it did until you mentioned it. But where do you think does need a rebrand?
So again, I'm just going to stick with my original answer.
No, you don't get... Everyone has to answer this fun question, otherwise it's no
Well,
fun.
I would definitely rebrand for Millbank as Iain Dale Central. That would be my definite vote.
Andrew Marmite has something
Slimy.
to say about that. Matthew?
I'd like to rename this place Corey Towers, to be honest with you, after your wonderful producer.
That is just creeping. Another invitation.
Down on the creep factors,
No, come on,
boys.
seriously.
I think people should all come to... I mean, I'm never been an MP and not been a councillor for years, but I think people should all come to Hinkley and
No, this is not the answer to the question.
see where
Answer
Richard
the
III
question.
fell, and then take the bus up to Leicester and see
Oh
where he was
my
found.
God.
You invited
Cindy,
him.
honestly, help
I'm
me.
scared to answer now. Well, it's not to improve the branding, but the way that some British politicians and pundits have been talking about Elon Musk in the last few weeks makes me think that actually the UK maybe should be rebranded as the America's 51st state, because it does seem like we are just being wagged by whatever is going on stateside. And, I say this as a big fan of Elon Musk's business dealings and technological achievements, but we should not be letting him set the agenda.
Well, I was looking for answers like Beirut, for example. But clearly I wasn't going to go... But Beirut is a fantastic... I've been there. It's a fantastic city, but I think probably does need a little bit of a rebrand. Because people think it's just a bomb site.
Do they?
Yeah. Well, you obviously don't then. Thank you all very much indeed, apart from your answers to that last question. Tomorrow's panel includes our second Liberal Democrat of the week. Mathew Hulbert will be having a fit of the vapours. Frontbencher Christine Jardine, The Sun's political journalist Jack Elsom, plus two MPs who were first elected last summer, Sian Berry from the Green Party and Patrick Spencer from the Conservatives. Now, Vicky Ford is staying with us. She is going to talk about the fact that she's revealed that she has breast cancer. In a post on social media, she said that she's been diagnosed after a routine mammogram between Christmas and the New Year. The question I want to put to you is, when you were diagnosed with cancer, it doesn't have to be breast cancer, any form of cancer, how did you react when you got the news? How was the news broken to you? And what happened then? Because I know that if I had that news, I would automatically think the worst was going to happen. Vicky has reacted incredibly optimistically to her diagnosis, but I wonder how typical that is. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the safeguarding minister's hit back at Elon Musk, but says she has more important things to think about than the Tesla owner. Jess Phillips says the world's richest man is ridiculous to call her a rape genocide apologist after she turned down request for a grooming inquiry. Conservative MP Sir John Hayes has told LBC he condemns Elon Musk's attacks on her.
Jess Phillips was wrong to refuse Oldham Council's request for a further inquiry, but the idea that you should attack people personally, you should threaten them, you should intimidate them, is absolutely